Work orders are obviously one of the key driving components inside your field service implementation. They're really going to define what specific work is going to be done, as well as provide all the details about how long it's going to last, what actually needs to be done on site when the person is going out there and accomplishing that. And so when you start talking about work orders, since they are such a critical component to what you're going to do, it's important to not only understand how work orders are used, but also understand how work orders make use of some of the other elements in field service, so you have the ability to effectively configure each one of those elements to really take advantage of how it's going to work in this application. So in this module, what we want to do is again, just look at work orders in general, provide kind of an overview of what they are, how they're captured, create a couple of work orders inside the application so you can really see some of the different elements in regards to how they're created. Look at the work order life cycle from start to finish. So what happens when you create it and then move it all the way through somebody actually completing it all the way at the end. And then also understand kind of the relationships in regards to other entities and where do they all fit into the work order process as you're creating them. And then look at how those other items such as incident types and service tasks and items get attached and can be created to make work order creation easier as you're moving forward. As we've talked about quite a bit to this point, a work order really captures the essence of what it is that we're going to be doing while we're out on site. So we're going to be servicing a printer, or we're going to be fixing a windshield, or servicing a refrigerator. What is the core responsibility of what it is that we're doing? Now, the other aspect of work orders is work orders really are also used to define and schedule who those resources are that are ultimately going to carry out this particular service, maybe based upon their skill sets. Now, the nice thing about work orders is when you're defining work orders and you go into your work order administration, you can actually set up different types of work orders based upon what types of services you provide. So they could be installations, they could be repairs, preventative maintenance, any of those types of items that you might be working with. Now, at the core of a work order, what key information that you're normally going to see, and we'll go into the work order here as well in a demo and actually walk through a lot of this in a little bit more detail, is obviously just a description of what that work order is, or the issue that you're going to be working on for that particular item. You're also going to spend a fair amount of time talking about who the customer is, or the service account that's affected, and that's really going to define the location of where that work order is being taking place. So who is the customer that we're trying to service? Based upon the customer that we're trying to service, where are they located, and how are we going to constitute that within the application itself? This is also going to help us to define what specific parts or products that we might need as part of that particular work order. So again, if we're replacing a fan on a specific refrigerator, or a refrigeration unit on that refrigerator, we maybe need to have those specific parts available to us. That lets us know that these are the parts that are going to be associated with it. The other thing is, a lot of times when you're going out and performing a lot of these common tasks, so if it's maintenance on a printer, or if it's replacing a windshield, there's a step-by-step process that you're typically going to do in order to facilitate that. And the nice thing with these work orders is, if we know what that step-by-step process generally is, we can create what are called incidents, or incident tasks, or service tasks that define, here's the tasks that need to be done while I'm out on site. And we can actually use those durations associated with those to roll up and create priorities and estimate the duration of the work order as it's being processed. And then again, other items that we've talked about obviously is the skills that are needed in order to facilitate that. In the previous demo, we saw that just by simply going in and creating and adding that MRI inspection incident type, that all sorts of different things, like the products that were associated with an MRI inspection, all the individualized service tasks that were associated with that inspection, as well as additional services and products, were all automatically attached to that work order. And that's really the entire point of those incidents, or those incident types, is think about common problems that as an organization you do on a fairly regular basis. Each one of those common problems will have specific tasks that need to be accomplished in order to facilitate that, generally have specified services that are attached to that, as well as individualized products and items. So by going in and creating your own incident types, now just by simply selecting those as part of the work order, now you have the capabilities to pre-populate that. And so what I'd like to do now is take you in and show you how you can create your own incident types so you can now leverage those as part of the item inside the application when you're moving forward. So I'm back in my field service implementation. Now let's go ahead and create an incident type. And so that's actually going to be done through our field service administrative settings. So I'm going to go into field service and I'm going to go into administration. And then one of the options that I'm going to see here is there's really two options here. There's the incident types, which we'll talk a little bit about now, and then there's the service task types, which we'll talk about here in just a couple of minutes. But let's first look at the incident types. So I'm going to go ahead and click on incident types. And here I can see these are some of the different ones that are in there. So there's that MRI inspection that we used in the previous example. I can see that they have one for a fan being out. They have one for cycling too long, and just kind of generalized options. So this is where we can go ahead and kind of create our own incident types that can be used as templates as part of the work order. So I'm just going to go ahead and click on new. And it's going to ask me, what do I want to call this? And so maybe from an application standpoint, I'm just going to call this, printer maintenance. Or let's say printer clean. Then when I go down into my details, this is where I can have an item to define how I want to work with this. So what is the work order type that might be associated with this? So this is typically going to be like a preventive maintenance type situation. So when I associate this with a specific work order, I would want to set the work order type to preventive maintenance. Now, one of the things that you'll see within these work order types is this is where I have the capabilities to also determine as part of a work order type if this can just be associated with a standardized work order, or if this work order type would require some type of case to be created first in order for me to be able to work with it. But in this case, we'll just go ahead and choose kind of the preventive maintenance option. Now, the estimated duration, I can actually have that kind of pre-populated information if I'm working with it based upon some of the service task options that we add into the system. But this is where I can now go in and kind of start building my individual situation. I could also take and I could copy these incident items specifically to any agreements if I have an agreement that's associated with this as well that I want to use as part of the agreement to be able to go ahead and kind of auto-populate some of the work order options from there. Now, this is the generalized information. Once I go ahead and hit save, now it's going to open up some of my other options that will be beneficial to what it is that I'm doing. So there might be a specific skill set of people that I want to be able to have in order to go ahead and perform this incident type that I'd want to have communicated back to me on the schedule board. So that's where these characteristics come into play. So now I can come into these characteristic options and I can add a characteristic directly to this incident type. And so here's where I can say, okay, here's the specific characteristic option that they would need. So what is the incident type? It's for printer cleanup. What is the characteristic that they need to have? So in this situation, I could define what specific type of characteristic they need to have. In this case, let's say they need to have building 12 access. And then this is also where I could define a rating value. Now in this case, I just really need them to have building 12 access. But if this was like a CRM skill set or a .NET skill set where maybe I needed somebody who was not necessarily just familiar but very proficient within the option, this is where I could define that particular proficiency level that would be required in order to facilitate this as part of the application. Now in this case, I can go ahead and hit save and close. And that'll just associate this particular characteristic with that item in the application. Now, in addition to this, there may be specific products that need to be associated with this as well. This is where I could now come in and I could define specific products within my organization that would be a part of this particular situation. So this is where I could find the specific product that I want to work with. In this case, we'll just say a monitor. We're going to use the primary unit. I only require one monitor as part of the item that I'm working with. This is where I can also determine where it shows up from an order perspective inside the incident itself. I could then hit save and close, and then it would save that particular item. And then if I wanted to add one more, maybe we'll just add one more to this option. Let's go ahead and just add a 60-watt light bulb as well, and then save and close. So what is going to happen is now the next time that I use this particular option, it's going to go ahead and automatically associate that information with it. Same thing if I were to come in here from a services perspective. So if there was a specific service that was going to be used in order to facilitate this, this is where I could now come in, define what that specific service might be, and then the default duration that's going to be associated with this particular item. So I can see that it kind of filters this information based upon the individual option. We'll just do a performance inspection. Then I can use that to kind of specify, default minutes. In this case, I don't need to worry about that. Those will be pre-populated based upon items that we've already kind of pre-selected and be able to adjust. Now I can go ahead and save and close, and they will add that particular service to this option. Now the next thing that we would want to do would be able to go in and add our specific service tasks. Now before we add our service tasks, I want to take you in and just talk a little bit about what service tasks are, and then we can go ahead and associate them with this incident type. The final piece to the whole incident type thing is the service task types. So we talked a lot about, when you create a work order, there might be a specific list of things that have to be done. These are the items that are going to roll up into that work order that will ultimately reflect the estimated duration of that work order based upon the item that you're going. So again, really think of tasks or service tasks as kind of a checklist in regards to what you need to be accomplishing as you're working through this this particular work order. Now the nice thing about this is as you're going in and defining what these specific service tasks are, you can go in and specify specific durations. Now each one of these durations will then roll up as part of the incident type, and then ultimately once that incident type is associated with the work order, they will roll up into the work order, which will then associate an estimated duration with that work order based upon the total elapsed time for the durations for the task types that are associated with it. So let's go ahead and take a look at what that looks like inside the application. So we're back into this printer cleanup incident that we created. Now we're going to go ahead and add these service tasks. So I'm going to go ahead and click on the Add button, and it'll open up my service task screen. So this is where I define what this specific service task is going to look like. So this is where I can define the task type that it is. So these are some different task types that have already kind of been pre-created. So these are options that are associated with the MRI and different options. But in this case, maybe I'm just going to go ahead and create my own. So I'm going to click on New to create my own kind of incident task type. And then I'm just going to define what this particular situation is. So we'll say that this is going to be replace toner. The estimated duration on this is a drop down. I can specify about how long we figure that's going to take. We figure that's going to take about 15 minutes. So now I can go ahead and I can save and close my replace toner. And now that's going to populate into my task type. And I can see that the estimated duration is pre-populated in with 15 minutes. And then again, the line order based upon what I want to do. Now in this case, I'll go ahead and hit save and close. And it's going to add that option to my item. Once I save this, then the estimated duration is going to roll up based upon those options. So if I wanted to create another option within this, maybe in this case, we're going to go ahead and we'll just call this clean printer heads. Create another new option. And maybe this is going to take a little bit longer. This will take about 30 minutes. Then we'll go ahead and save and close this option. And save and close. Now we'll do one more here. I'm going to go ahead and create one more new one. We'll call this testing And we'll make this 15 minutes as well. And save and close. Now, after I go through and once everything is kind of committed based upon this, then the estimated duration is going to roll up based upon those options. So now I can basically go ahead at this point and close out of this option. And now if I were to go back into my incident types and I were to go into my printer cleanup, I can now see that the estimated duration is populated to an hour because within this situation, it's looked at the total combined option for all of those tasks. So now, bringing this kind of full circle, if I were to go back into field service and work orders, and I were to create a new work order, this time we'll go to active transport. We'll set it up as open unscheduled. We'll pick our primary incident type of printer cleanup. It'll populate in my estimated duration. We can see that it's automatically associated it with preventive maintenance. It's using the default price list. We're going to associate this with our service territory of Washington. We're going to make this non-taxable just for today's purposes. Now I can go ahead and save and close the workflow, or save and close the work order, rather. And now we'd give this obviously a little bit of time for the information to kind of pre-populate and come up within the application. But now once I were to go ahead and open this up, it would then go in and I could see that all of those individual items that we'd associate with this particular work order when we create, or with this incident type or task when we created it, will now be pre-populated into the work order. So now if I were to scroll down into this work order and look at my service tasks, there's the individual service tasks that have populated in from that. There's the individual products that have populated in, and then the services, and then if I went up, I could see the characteristics as well. So these are a great way that if you want to streamline the creation of these work orders, that you can do so just by simply using a combination of the incidents as well as the service task types that are associated with the incidents. So before we go in and take a look at creating a work order and kind of doing the demo, I want to talk to just a little bit about accounts first, because there's a couple of different account options that you need to remember when you're working with work orders. So all work orders are going to be tied to a specific account of some kind. And when we talk about an account record, we're talking about a Dynamics 365 account record in the application. Now there's two real types of accounts. There's the service account and there's what are called the billing account. Now by default, the service account is really the most important aspect because that's obviously where the work order is going to take place from an application standpoint. That's also what's going to be used for like the scheduling assistant and used to calculate travel times, because it's going to look at the address that's associated with the service account that's attached to that particular work order. Now every single work order that you work with has to have a service account associated with it. Even if you're using it for an internal situation, you still would have to associate it with an internal service account from inside the application. Now, in addition to that, you can also do what are called billing accounts. Now, the billing account is going to be who's obviously going to receive the bill for that particular item. Now, by default, when you first create a work order, you specify the service account. The service account will also be designated as the billing account. However, if you want to, you do have the capabilities to change that at any time to reflect the billing account. Now, a billing account might have multiple service accounts or locations that they are handling the billing for. So within those accounts as well, you can add sub-accounts to them that can be associated with the individual items that you might be billing as part of that. Now, field service uses what is called kind of geolocations or geolocating for determining the address of the account or the item that's going to be associated with the work order. Now, when it ships out of the box, it doesn't necessarily have that mapping functionality turned on. So one of the key things that you do need to do when you are going to create these individual items is you do need to go in and define some of the different geocoding options and set that up so the system knows to use it. If you don't, you will get an error message that tells you that it's not turned on from an application standpoint and that you need to configure it. So let's first look at how you configure some of that geolocating options. So I'm going to go into field service, and I'm actually going to go into the resource scheduling because it's under administration for the resource scheduling. And so when I go in here, there's a couple of different options. There's one that allows me to enable resource scheduling for entities other than the work order entity. This would be for kind of the unified scheduling feature that is now a part of field service. But then there's also the schedule parameters, and this is where you can go in and you can modify just kind of how things appear when you start working with the calendar. This is also where your geocoding information is. So if I go into my schedule parameters, one of the options that I'll see underneath here is whether or not I want to connect this to maps. And so this is basically going to enable the address to go out and use a mapping service provider. Now, it could be any number of external service providers. By default, it's going to be Bing, obviously from an application standpoint, but this is what's going to allow it to kind of physically match the address that's associated with that account inside the system. So I'm going to go ahead and turn that on, but then you can also see, and we'll talk a little bit more about this when we get into the schedule board, this is where I can look at kind of how often the schedule board is refreshing. This is where I can look at default radiuses. I can apply filters based upon territories. This is just some of my baseline information that I could use from a resource scheduling perspective. Now in this case, we'll just go ahead and save our changes. And now let's go in and look at the account perspective. So I'm going to go back into field service and I'm going to click on accounts. And again, all the accounts that we're going to be servicing are going to be just generalized Dynamics 365 accounts. So if I go ahead and open up this ADATM Corporation sample, one of the things that I'll see in here is just the information about the account itself and some of the addressing information. And if I click on this expand option, I'll see a geocode. And when I click on this, this is going to go out and it's going to take the individual address parameters, so the street address, the city, the state, and the zip code, and it's going to geolocate that with a longitude and latitude using Bing Maps. Now, there are some options to link with external providers and do things where it isn't necessarily requiring longitude and latitude, but by default it typically is based off of a longitude and latitude option. If I ever detected multiple addresses for this, this would let me know that there's multiple address matches and it would show each one, and then I could pick which individual address map I wanted to work with. But this shows you specifically how this is geolocated on the address. So if you do make a change to the address, you may want to go in and just update the individualized address information so you have that information as you're moving forward. Now, if I scroll down as part of this, I'll also see that I have some field service information that's now attached to this. So this is where, from a servicing account perspective, I can define what specific items might be associated with this. So, for example, if this particular account has a different billing account associated with it, I could specify what this billing account is. So when I create the work order and specify this as the service account, it'll default to the appropriate billing account. This is also where, if I wanted to, talk about whether or not this is tax exempt, if I wanted to do any service territories or anything like that, or if I wanted to charge for travel types, this is where I could now start to define specifics around what this customer prefers from a field service preferences, particularly when we start looking at how we're going to create and define work orders inside the field service application. So this is also one of the other considerations that you want to look at as you're building this, is how are you going to set up these accounts to define the individual statuses and items that you want to work with. From here, I am now ready to go ahead and create a work order. So I can go into field service and I can go into work orders. And this is where I can now create my work order. So I can see that I have several different work orders that are already kind of set up and processed in regards to the sample data. So by looking at my active work orders, I can see what the status of these individual items are. If they're currently being worked on, if they're scheduled, if they're completed, if they're unscheduled. This allows me to see what specific type of situation it is. So this is where I could now create a specific work order in the application. So now I can come in here, create my work order. And it's just going to guide me through kind of those generalized situations that we've talked about. So the work order number will be auto-populated based upon those field service settings that we initially defined, that where I set up what I wanted to use for my work order starting number. This is where I now can define what is going to be the service account. So in this case, I can use ADATUM Corporation. And you'll notice that it automatically defaults ADATUM Corporation as the billing account because we haven't specified any other sub-process of this option that we wanted to work with. This also will default in with a system status. So these system statuses are going to define whether or not the work order is scheduled, in progress. A lot of these are going to correlate based upon the resource booking that has been assigned with this particular item once we go out and define it on the schedule board. I also have the ability, if I want to do what are called system substatuses. And so this is where if I was going to go out and do some type of other situation where maybe I require a follow-up, or maybe there's some type of parts that we're looking at, this is where I can create more specified subsystem statuses that I can use to really see more detailed information about what's happening specifically with this work order. I'm not necessarily going to do anything in here, but this is where I could define that if I wanted to. Now, when I start getting into the work order itself, this is where I can start to work with and define specific incidents. And so when we talk about an incident, we're not necessarily talking about a case, which although you can create a work order from a case, and we can show you that as well, what we're talking about is those predefined incidents that really handle common task items within the application. And so when I go through this primary incident type, this is going to have several different things that might be associated with it. So for example, I'm going to go out and I'm going to do an MRI inspection. And when I click on MRI inspection, one of the things that this will do is this will go out and specify kind of an estimated duration for this work order based upon the fact that this might be tied to a specific service tasks that are attached to this primary incident. And we're going to show you when we actually go in here in a few minutes, we'll create a couple of incident types so you can see specifically how they coordinate with what's happening. Now, as I scroll through, if this was going to be associated with a specific customer asset. So maybe this customer has an MRI machine at their location. This is where I could now go in and specify that I'm doing this MRI inspection associated with this MRI piece of equipment that this customer has to allow me to better kind of define and track what's happening within the work order itself. And then as I scroll through, you'll see that because I picked that this was an MRI inspection, other things such as the work order type automatically defaulted in. So it realized that it needed to go in and specify what the work order type is. It specified it as an inspection. But again, if I wanted to, I could change this work order type to any number of predefined work order types that we could configure inside our field service administration settings. I also have the ability to associate it with a price list. We could attach a priority to it if we needed to. This is where I can also define where the work is taking place. So if the location, if it's remote stuff and it's location agnostic, I could define that. If there's a specific on-site scenario that I'm working with, we could specify it from there. And then I could also specify the service territory. Now, if I had known what the service territory was going to be prior to creating the particular item, when I worked with the account, it could have predefined that particular situation, but we could work with it. Now, depending upon how we've defined these and how things are kind of created, we also can have things such as when it's going to be, when it was promised to be started, when we figured it was going to start. This is where I can see some of the initial items that might be associated with it. If this is a taxable item, I can specify it as yes, it's taxable, and then I can specify the sales tax code. So this is where I could go in and I could create specific sales tax codes that would represent specific items that would work with from within our organization. In this case, we'll just say that it is not taxable. And then this is also where, as this work order is being created, this work order could be associated with other records inside the application. One of the things we'll talk about in a future module is the whole agreement process. So if I have agreements that are automatically creating these workflows or these work orders for us, I could see that this particular item was associated with that agreement. But just like any scenario, we talked about the fact that work orders could be created automatically off of opportunities and cases. So if I escalated this from a case perspective, I would be able to see what opportunity and what case might be associated with this. Or if maybe this was coming from another work order, I would be able to see information from there. And then obviously as part of this information, I can see the geocoding address information that has been brought into this information based upon what was happening from that account. Now, in addition to that, I can see things like the service tasks, the products and services. This is going to show me specific items or items that might be associated with this from a to-do standpoint. Now, because I haven't saved this yet, I don't necessarily see any of those items, but let me go ahead and save this record real quick. And once this record is saved, now I can go in and I can expand some of these different service tasks and I can expand some of these different products and services. And what's happening behind the scene is it's looking at the specific item that was associated with this incident type, and it's actually bringing those in. So initially, if I were to go ahead and let's just kind of close out of this work order for right now, and let's go ahead and open it back up. Now if I come down into this work order and I go into my service tasks, I can see here's the steps that are generally involved with an MRI inspection. I can see that first we have to go in, we have to measure the energy, we have to then perform the estimate, we then have to go in and we have to promote the item for the option, and then we have to collect our custom data. And each one of these has an estimated duration. So this is where, from a to-do perspective, now the technician knows these are generally the 4 items that need to take place as part of this option. And this is one of those advantages to using those incidents, because now I have the ability to have a lot of this information be pre-populated. Now I could obviously come in here and just add individual items to this if I wanted to. Same thing with products. I could go into products and I can see that, okay, as part of this estimate, I have lithium batteries that need to be associated with this. I have coils that need to be associated with it. So this is where I could define how many items I wanted to work with in regards to this. And this would be another option where being able to utilize things like the editable subgrid feature inside Dynamics 365 would give you the capabilities to really go in and modify the quantities kind of on hand or as you're working through it. Same thing with the services. I know that this is how long it's going to typically take for that individual situation. I can see that the cost is associated with this, and this is where I can see kind of the estimated scenario. So this is how you can go in and create kind of those work orders, and how these work orders can be correlated with some of those other items that we've talked about from a related items perspective. Now, in addition to that, if I go up here on the top of this and I go into my related items, I can see that I also have the capabilities to really navigate to any of the incidents, products, or service tasks directly from the related items option. But I also could go in here and if I had specific characteristics. So if there was a skill set that was specifically needed in order to function this particular option, I could go ahead and click on that and see that there is. Now, in this case, it requires that we have access to building 12. And so this was a characteristic that was automatically associated with that incident type when it was added to it. But if there was other skill sets that I wanted to work with, I could add those specific skill sets in here as characteristics. So when it comes into scheduling that option, I could go ahead and schedule that option accordingly. Now, that's the manual process. Again, we talked a little bit about from an application perspective that in addition to that, I could also go in and I could generate this from like an opportunity or from like a contact. So for example, if I have an opportunity and I open up an opportunity inside the system, you'll see right on the command bar for the opportunity that there's an option to convert to a work order. So in here, I can go ahead and click on convert to a work order. This is going to automatically convert this to a work order. Now I do need a price list, so let's just go ahead and pick the default price list for this particular option. And then I can convert this to a work order. and it would then allow me to go ahead and convert this as part of the work order. I would have to define the type of work order that was going to be set up from this standpoint, and that's one of the things that I can predetermine as I'm going through that conversion process. But it's very simple to allow me to kind of convert this straight from this item into a work order. Same thing would be associated with a case if I wanted to do that inside the application as well. Before we go in and take a look at how you create a work order and all the different elements that are associated with those work orders, let's just talk a little bit about the life cycle and understand how a work order kind of works through the life cycle process inside field service. So there's really kind of 5 key elements, and then obviously there would be kind of an invoicing piece that would work off of it as well. But it all starts with, as we've talked about, kind of work order creation. And so when a work order is created, there's a couple of different ways that could happen from an application standpoint. But once somebody goes in and creates a work order, it will automatically associate any incidents, products, or services that we may have defined based upon any incident types that we've associated with the work order itself. Now, as far as work order creation, who's going to do that, that could be done through a variety of different situations. Work orders might be fired off based upon an agreement. So we have a service agreement that we've entered into with this customer that says we will provide this level of service to them as they're working through, so they might go in and provide it from there. Maybe, as we talked about, maybe you have a technician who's working on a case, and that case now needs to be escalated, so that item is going to be created from there. Maybe from an opportunity, both the case and the opportunity entity have the ability to create them from there. Or manually, you might have a dispatcher that just goes in and creates a work order based upon those individual situations, or even has a technician that might create a work order when they're out on site. Whenever a work order is created, it goes into really a status of open with unscheduled, which means it has not been scheduled at this point. It's waiting for us to be scheduled, and then we could add further kind of substatuses to that work order if we wanted to tailor it a little bit more. Now, you notice it says booking status. So because it's unscheduled, we haven't scheduled it yet. There's no booking record associated with it at this point. That's why the booking status is set to not available. Now, when we go into scheduling it, so now somebody goes out onto the schedule board and actually defines how to schedule it, what ends up happening is a record which is called a bookable resource booking is created, which defines the actual resource that is going to be associated with this carrying out this work order and whatever specific date and time has been specified. Now, this could be done through a few different situations as far as scheduling it. The dispatcher could manually do it as part of the schedule board. The field agent could schedule it either manually or on the mobile device, or the scheduler might do it with help of the scheduling assistant or even the resource optimization routing engine that's available as well. But once it's been scheduled, now the work order goes to a status of open and scheduled, and then you have a booking status that would be scheduled at that particular point. And now it's ready to go out and to be dispatched. And so once it's dispatched, this is where we can trigger notifications. So this is where we could let the field agent know that the work order is available to them. A notification could be sent to either them, it could be sent through to the customer or others. There could be different notification levels that would be sent. And then the work order status is still scheduled, and then the booking status is scheduled. Now, you can also, as part of these booking statuses, you can define your own booking statuses based upon what you might want to work with, but default out of the box they would be is scheduled. Now, once the technician is out performing that service and they're actually working through it, now you have a couple of different situations. The booking statuses might have any number of different scenarios, but key ones that you would normally see at that point would be either traveling or in progress or ultimately maybe moving it to completed. Now, what happens is that work order standpoint basically goes from open into open in progress. And then ultimately, as that technician finishes that particular service call, they will then transfer that work order status from open in progress to open completed, which basically says that I'm done with this particular item. Now, once it's been open and completed, now it would go into kind of a reviewer who would then be able to go in and move that from an open completed to closed posted. And once it's been closed posted, this is where your invoicing software could now come into play, and this is where we could automatically generate invoices within the application. But it's important to notice that that's how this process works when you start defining how these work orders are going to be carried from one stage to the next. There's a lot of different elements that will have some type of tie or relationship with work orders as part of the field service implementation. Now, each of these elements that have these relationships provide specific functionality within the context of the application. Now, before we go in and we start looking at each one of those relationships, let's actually just kind of look at work order relationships with some of the key elements of the application that you would be working with. So as you can see here in this kind of area, we have several different items, but let's focus on kind of the middle bar as far as what's going through. Think of the work order itself as what is actually happening inside the application. So what is going to be done? What is the work? What is the item that we're actually trying to accomplish? The service account is really going to be the where. So who is the customer that we are going to be providing this service for? And the service account is the destination as to where we will be providing this information. Now, the billing account is going to be the account that's responsible for paying for it. Now, the billing account might be the same as the service account, or it might be something totally different depending upon how their organization structure is set up within the application itself. The resource booking is who is going to perform this particular responsibility or work on this work order, and when are they going to be doing this. So think of the resource booking as the who and the when, and then the resource obviously is the who. So the resource will be associated with the resource booking. The resource booking will define the who and the when, which will be associated with the order. The order will then have a service account associated with it, which may have a billing account associated with it. So those are kind of your key pieces of information when you look at the work order as kind of a whole in its grand scheme of things. Now let's look at some of the other individualized pieces that would make that up. So let's first go ahead and look at kind of our work order types and priorities. So when you start talking about a work order type, this is really only used for categorization purposes. Now, out of the box, you're going to see things like, installation, break fix, preventative maintenance, but that's really what they are, is what are you going to, what type of work order is this? How are we categorizing this individual element or work that we're going through? This is where you can go into your field service administration settings, and this is where you could define different work order types based upon what it is that you want to work with. Now, the other option that you have is your priority option. So each work order can have a priority rating associated with it, which would then rate the importance of the work order. Now, why this is important is because this directly corresponds with what's going to happen inside the scheduling board and the scheduling assistant and some of the automation processes, is because it's going to look at those priorities, and it's going to take some of those work orders with higher priorities, and it's going to place them obviously in front of work orders with lower priorities. And so this allows you to look at what some of those individual situations are and make it more effective as you're going through it. Now, the other situation we've talked about is the service territory. So up until this point, we've talked about how the service territory can be used on the scheduling board to define where things are going to be scheduled. The service territory is important from an application perspective because that's obviously what's going to go out and allow us to associate this work order with a specific service territory. So when we're coordinating it on the schedule board, we can filter resources based upon those options. Now let's look at the other side of this in regards to kind of some of the related element entities that you would be working with. So each work order could potentially have what's called an incident or an incident type. Think of an incident or an incident type as almost like common templated issues that you would be working with. So if I'm going out and I am going to fix a refrigerator, I know that for fixing a refrigerator, I need to have these particular products with me on the truck. So I have to have a compressor, I have to have refrigerant or whatever that situation is. I probably have to have some valves and some items available. I also know that if we're fixing the fridge, that service constitutes X amount of time and X amount of dollars, and these are the specific tasks that we're going to be working with on those items. So what an incident does is it almost formulates a template. So when you associate an incident with a work order, that incident can automatically have products associated with it. Now, when you're creating the work order, you can go in and just define the products that you want to use on the work order as well, but you also have the capabilities to automate that a little bit more by using the incident and adding items from there. Now, the other thing that you'll see in there is the services. So obviously, if I'm going out and I'm fixing a printer, I'm going to charge you for the time that we're using to fix that printer. That's going to be the services that are going to be defined within that. Now, as I'm going through and I am fixing that printer, there might be specific step-by-step procedures that I need to do to fix that printer. First and foremost, I'm going to, blow out all of the toner within that scenario and basically clean everything out from that standpoint. Then I'm going to go in, I'm going to lube the gears, and I know that lubing the gears and greasing everything inside that printer or whatever that process might look like is going to take 15 minutes. And then I'm going to replace the toner cartridges, and I know that replacing the toner cartridges generally takes 15 minutes. And then we're going to run through a couple of system checks, and that's going to take maybe 15 to 20 minutes. And so what I can do with these service tasks is I can actually go in and add these service tasks to the work order, and each one of those service tasks can have a specified duration associated with it. Now the technician can use that almost like a checklist that says, okay, when I'm out and I'm doing this, this is what I have to do first, this is what I have to do second, and I can roll that information up into that to make sure that I understand specifically about how long that should take as I'm going through. And then ultimately they also have the characteristics that we've talked about, where I can go in and determine what specific kind of skill sets or knowledge level the person should have in order to be able to work on this particular item. So these are all critical elements that are going to interface with the work order as you're working through it. As you can see, work orders really do play a critical piece and are really one of the critical or main components when we start talking about a field service implementation. So it's real important to understand how those work orders are going to be created within the system, and planning ahead of time to understand, are they going to come in from cases? Are they going to be auto-created from opportunities? Will they be manually created? Will they even maybe come in from an agreement standpoint, which we'll talk about in another option? Regardless of how that work order is going to be created, key things to remember is that work order does have to be associated with a service account. Even if you're going to use that work order for internal purposes, you still need to define who the service account is for that work order, because that's really going to define where that particular work order is going to take place. Now, additional options available within those work orders are defining, whether there's a separate billing account if you wanted to, even going in and defining territories. But the critical aspect of that is going to be who you are servicing that account, or who you are servicing that with that work order inside the application. Now, the other thing is, when you start looking at how you're going to streamline that work order creation process, that's where incidents come into play. And by going in and creating different incident types, now you have the ability to pre-populate items such as the services that are going to be associated with that particular work order, any products that might be used, as well as the specific tasks that will be generated in regards to those options, or even just the skill sets that are going to be used as part of the scheduling board to define who should be available to work with those. So all of those individual items come in from a combination perspective to really help work with that. So really consider using incident types as a way to streamline the work order creation process inside the system.